Good morning. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and I want to welcome our audience to today's Government Affairs Forum. I hope you're all tuning in, feeling safe and warm this morning with your shovels ready for another snow event this afternoon and tomorrow. It is February in New England, after all. But before that, we're thrilled this morning to be joined by a very special speaker, our Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker. The governor shares the Chamber's passion for making this region and the state the best place for all businesses and all people to thrive. Thinking back, it was a year ago that we had our last live Government Affairs Forum, and it was featuring Governor Charlie Baker. Since then, we've been in this virtual format, and thinking back again, we talked about many different things than we may talk about today with Governor Baker. Governor, our membership always looks forward to this annual event, and we're grateful that you make time each year to join the Greater Boston business community. Before I get started, I'd like to begin with a huge thank you to our sponsor, Bank of America, our longstanding partner in these Government Affairs Forum series, as well as a leading member of the Greater Boston and Massachusetts business community who has stepped up in so many ways, especially over the past year, to lift up those that especially need help during this pandemic crisis. To Ann Finucane, my friend Michal Chamberlain, and the entire team from Bank of America, thank you from the Chamber community for supporting these events and enabling us to bring relevant content to the community. And a thank you to our friends at Comcast, who helped to bring our government affairs programs to a wider audience, including making this available via on-demand. A few housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page in the coming weeks. And I want to encourage you to utilize the chat and Q&A functions during today's conversation. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to the Vice Chair of Bank of America and Chair of the Board of Bank of America Europe, Ann Finucane, to introduce the Governor Baker.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jim. This is an interesting day. Listen, we remain delighted on behalf of Michal Chamberlain and myself to the partnership with the Chamber, and it's hard to believe we're kicking off our 17th year of sponsoring the Government Affairs Forum. So hello all. I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker today, the Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker. It's hard to say anything about Charlie, Governor Baker and his administration without the words COVID and pandemic, but I am going to try to remind us all of a few other things. Now in his second term, Governor Baker has been committed to making Massachusetts a place that everyone and everything can thrive. He has also demonstrated the ability to work in a highly bipartisan way in Massachusetts. He and his administration continue to work hard for and with the private sector and investing in fixing and improving the MBTA, our transportation infrastructure system sort of overall, ensuring Massachusetts remains a leader in education from preschool through higher education, and also career vocational programs, which grow in more importance every day. And then prioritizing funds for the opioid crisis that we are also aware of. As our governor, he has shown great leadership in working to address the Commonwealth's housing shortage, as well as the issues that we have around energy costs and climate change. And of course, today, maybe sort of in spite of this year, you know, Governor Baker started his administration with sort of a snowmageddon, and I think maybe today and the next few days might be more of that. And in this year, he's dealing with a worldwide pandemic. So Governor Baker and his administration have led the Commonwealth through this pandemic and through an economic and sometimes political crisis in this country here, dealing with challenges so well and with such dignity and honesty. I'm glad he is able to be with us here again today. Please join me in welcoming Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker. Good morning, Governor.
Good morning, Ann. Thank you very much. And I also appreciate you reminding me that at one point in time, we worried about a little more than just COVID here in the Commonwealth. Let me just start, first of all, by saying that I appreciate the chance to be here. And Jim, I was thinking about the fact that this was one of the last public events that I did in a traditional way before everything changed last year in March. And it's very different to do this virtually. And I'm sure everybody who's been working virtually will understand what I mean when I say that you do lose a lot of the chit chat and the informality, and in some respects the benefits of physical presence when you play the game this way. A typical visit to a chamber event like the breakfast for me would be, a wander through the through the outside room where everybody's getting coffee, where you talk to people and catch up with them on whatever's on their minds, and then you wander into the room and you do the same thing. And by the time you sit down, you've talked to, I don't know, 20 or 30 people, and you have some sense about what's on everybody's mind. And then you have a chance to sort of see the audience as you speak to them and get a sense for where you may go harder and deeper on something, and where you might sort of skip over something based on what you're seeing from the crowd. And I think in many ways, then when you do the Q&A and all the rest, you're in a very different place, having had a chance to sense the crowd a bit before that all begins. And I certainly think that once the dust settles on COVID, there will be a desire for people to re-engage with each other in some way. And I think one of the things that's going to be a big challenge for folks in public life and in private life who are involved in organizations of almost any kind is going to be, what does that look like and how does it work? With respect to the COVID issues, I would just say this: we seem to be on a pretty solid downward trajectory with respect to new cases and hospitalization rates since kind of the beginning of the new year. We had a really sort of a relentless incremental run up in new cases and hospitalizations after Labor Day, and then a giant jump after Thanksgiving. And I think many of us were worried we would see something similar to that after Christmas and New Year's, and that really didn't materialize. But at this point in time, because of the decline we've seen in cases and in hospitalizations over the course of the past literally 5 or 6 weeks, we did manage to take some of the rules and restrictions we had in place with respect to business operations off the table, and are currently operating at what I would describe a general status of around 40% occupancy for indoor entertainment activities of one kind or another, and still pretty strict rules around gatherings generally. And I think one of the things we're sort of paying attention to is whether some of these variants are going to change anything with respect to trend. And so far at this point, we just haven't seen that. But obviously, we'll wait and see what happens from there. With respect to the vaccine issue, I guess I would say the following. First of all, they're here, and I know how much that means to everybody, because this is in many ways a huge piece of the turning of the page. And here in the Commonwealth, we made some decisions to prioritize certain populations early. We had a group of sort of experts to help guide us on this. And we focused early on what we would call sort of preservation of life and healthcare capacity issues. So pretty intensive pursuit of everybody who was working in the healthcare and hospitals community to make sure that they got vaccinated early. I mean, I can't tell you, at one point in time in the fall, there were literally thousands of healthcare workers who were either out because they had COVID or out because they'd been exposed to somebody who had COVID. And it dropped our capacity across the healthcare system by significant numbers at exactly the same time we saw that big bump in cases and in hospitalizations. And I think the decision, every week I talk to the hospital community, and every week I ask them what's going on with staff. And the good news there is many of their staff did get vaccinated, and starting in December, and as a result, their staffing issues have really, they haven't completely straightened out, but they've significantly straightened out from where they were, which obviously means more capacity in the system to take care of people, not just those who have COVID, but everybody else as well. We were also, even though the long-term care program was run through the federal program with CVS and Walgreens, we've been pretty aggressive partners with them on this and with our colleagues in the long-term care community. And as a result, people have made many trips to visit our skilled nursing facilities and to vaccinate residents and staff. And while the national averages around staff vaccinations are in the sort of mid 30s and low 40s, we're actually up around 75% of staff getting vaccinated there, which is really important for obvious reasons. And in addition to that, we're north of 90% on residents getting vaccinated, which is also above the national average. I think we have one more trip through the long-term care community to pick up anybody who needs a second dose. But that news, I think, is also good given the significance of that community, both at the staffing side and the resident side with respect to COVID vulnerability. We also made a decision early on to focus on some populations that I don't think anybody else in America focused on, but they were important. People with developmental disabilities who live in congregate care settings and the staff who work with them. Same with people with mental health issues who live in congregate care settings and their staff. People who are homeless and in homeless shelters and the staff there. PCAs, personal care attendants, and home health care aides. There are probably 100,000 of those in Massachusetts, and they spend almost every day working with people who are compromised in one way or another. Many of them spend their time working with people who are over the age of 65 and compromised. And I think in many ways, this was partly about making sure that that they got vaccinated for the right reasons, but it was also about reducing the likelihood of spread from them to the people that they served. And again, I think that was the right decision. And first responders, obviously, who just constantly for the past year or so have been walking and running into all kinds of environments without having any idea about who was there or what their status was. And this definitely slowed down a bit of our rollout. But you know, bottom line was we felt these were hard to get populations, but they were important and they were vulnerable, and that's where we should focus. And as we came out of that, we then pivoted to the 75 plus crowd and a more traditional approach to vaccinating people, and opened up several large sites as well as some pretty successful regional collaboratives. Berkshire County actually has the highest percentage of population of any county in Massachusetts that's received the first dose. Statewide, we're at around 13%, which puts us up near the top of the country, certainly top half of the country. The numbers are close enough in some respects, they vary from day to day, but we're certainly in the top 20. And I know we're in the top 10 in terms of states that have more than 5 million people, which is about 24 or 25. But Berkshire County and Barnstable County, the two ends of the state, have the highest rate of people who have been vaccinated at least once in their population. Franklin County, which also has a regional collaborative, is third. And I think in many ways, those regional collaboratives have turned out to be an incredibly powerful and effective way to reach a lot of people and to get folks engaged in getting vaccinated. We have tons of work to do going forward on this, but I think every governor would tell you that the biggest challenge they face at this point is supply. We have, we get about 100 and, we used to get about 110,000 first doses a week. We're currently scheduled next week to start getting 130,000 new first doses a week. That'd be great. But we will get roughly 450,000 asks for first doses each week. So we're currently in a situation where we're getting about 4 times as many asks from the very capable and well-positioned community we have out there that's able and ready to vaccinate people for the doses that we've got available for first doses. And the reason we focus on first doses is because once you get somebody dosed for the first time, the second dose just arrives within a certain period of time from the feds. And you have to have the capacity to deliver the second dose, but that really hasn't been the issue. The real issue has been how fast can you move people through the first dose part of the phase with the understanding that when their second dose comes, that's going to be there. So the number we've really focused on, and this isn't just in Massachusetts, this is around the country, is how many first doses you're going to get, because you're pretty sure you're going to get the second dose when that becomes necessary. I do think the weather, which, Jim mentioned, there's going to be a snowstorm. We may have some real issues with supply delivery this week. And we had been told that it would be a few days late based on some of the issues around weather in other parts of the country. But we got told last night that we might see a significant delay in our next shipments. And you'll probably see news later this morning about us and other states sort of trying to take this one into our own hands. We're currently talking to the National Guard about, and they will do this, about going down to Kentucky and Tennessee, which is where this stuff is currently located, and bringing it back. And what we just need to do is make sure that the federal government's going to let the National Guard do this for us. We can't afford to go what will be almost a week without getting any new doses from the feds and continue to maintain the appointment schedules that people here expect and anticipate we'll be able to maintain. The process of getting 4.5 million people, 5 million people vaccinated at 120,000 first doses a week. I mean, you folks can all do the math. That will take a very long time, which is one of the reasons why so many governors are really anxious to see what happens with the J&J vaccination, which is currently in front of the FDA, and I think is supposed to be reviewed and decided on next week. And for many of us, that's a one-dose vaccine. It's going to be really important in the grand scheme of things, because not only does it bring a third vaccine into the mix, it's a one dose instead of a 2-dose, and it's J&J, which is a very big company that we all assume will be able to generate significant manufacturing and distribution capability in a pretty short period of time. The other thing I just want to say about vaccines, because I think this has been a little complicated in the reporting. They have varying degrees of efficacy when it comes to symptoms, okay? So when somebody talks about a vaccine that's 94% or 95% or 78% or 65% effective, what they mean is effective against ever getting symptoms, all right? But all three of these vaccines are 100% effective about hospitalizations and death. And I think in many ways, the key ingredient in this is that notion that with literally hundreds of thousands of people who've gone through clinical trials, on all three of those, nobody got hospitalized and nobody died who got the vaccine. And in some cases, some percent more than others, depending upon where the clinical trial was conducted, got symptoms. But I think for everybody, the real challenge here is to ensure people won't get so sick that they need to go to the hospital, and obviously won't get so sick that this becomes a life-threatening issue for them. And I think in some ways, all three vaccines passed the test in their clinical trials on this issue. And I think that's going to be an important one, not so much for people like me to talk about, but for doctors and for the CDC and for others to speak to. With respect to the economy and the state budget and some of the stuff that we've talked about in our live meetings before, I would just say this. At the peak, Massachusetts had about a 17% unemployment rate back in the spring. With the help of a lot of people, some of whom I'm sure are in this audience, who participated in our reopening program that was run by Housing and Economic Development Secretary Mike Keneally and Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, we managed to get hundreds of thousands of people back to work, and our unemployment rate by the fall was pretty consistent with the national average, which was still high. It was around 6.5%. The national average at the time was about the same. And we had let's see now, I'm just doing the math. We still had roughly 300,000 people, plus or minus, who hadn't been able to find a path back to work yet. And part of that has to do with the sort of unfairness and the brutality in some ways of COVID, in the sense that, and I've talked to a lot of folks in the private sector about this as well. You know, I've had a lot of people say, you know, COVID has an arc, right? And if you're on the right side of the arc, you're not any smarter than you were before COVID showed up, but you end up doing a lot better because you're on the right side of the arc. And if you're on the wrong side of the arc, you're not any dumber than you were the day before. You just end up in a far more difficult position with respect to your ability to perform and succeed. And I think there's no better example of that than there was a story in the Journal yesterday about Arne Sorensen, who was the first non-Marriott CEO of the Marriott Corporation, and he just passed away of pancreatic cancer. But they talked about the fact that COVID just decimated the hotel industry for all the obvious reasons, and especially one like Marriott, which has always historically catered to business travelers. And he talked about, the story talked about the fact that when he had to do a town hall with all of their employees to talk about furloughs and layoffs, it was a very emotional and difficult moment for him. And his speech on this actually went viral at the time. And in many ways, Marriott hadn't done anything wrong, right? And their employees hadn't done anything wrong either. They were just on the wrong side of what was going on with respect to COVID. And I think for us, a state that has a tremendous amount, at least historically, of global relationships and participation and travel, I think one of our greatest challenges as we go forward is going to be to try and figure out what the game plan is going to be for some of these industries on the lower side of the arc of this line. And in addition to that, how will things change with respect to those sectors of the economy and other sectors as we go forward? And we have a group right now working on what we're talking about as the future of work. And it's not the historical, usually the way we think about the future of work is where are the jobs going to be, right? What categories, who do we need, what kind of training do we need to make available, that kind of stuff. This one's more like, how are people going to work? Where are they going to work? Where are they going to live based on how and where they can work? And the reason this is such a tough question to answer is because we're not through the pandemic yet. But there's clearly been a year's worth of people thinking very differently about how they do their jobs. And whenever I have a group of state employees on a call with a big screen in front of me with all kinds of people on it, one of the questions I always say to people is, okay, so you folks have all been working remotely for the past year. How many want to come back to work in your office 5 days a week? Pretty much nobody raises their hand. And they say, well, how many of you would like to just stay remote and not come back at all? Nobody raises their hand on that one either. The sweet spot seems to be, well, what if you could come in, 1 or 2 or 3 days a week, or maybe more or less, depending upon what was going on that week? And that's the one where every hand on the screen goes up. And it speaks to the fact that I think for many organizations, the way they operate is going to be different, even when we get through the pandemic. And we've had a lot of folks in the executive branch and state government who have come up with some ways of doing things that are actually more effective in some ways than the in-person way they did it before. We've been able to match job seekers with people who are looking for employees in far greater numbers using virtual town halls and job fairs than we could ever do trying to do this stuff in person. And almost all of the sort of workshops and town halls that historically we would have done for annual enrollment for health insurance as an employer, we did all that stuff online, and it was way more effective in terms of the number of people who are able to participate and get their questions answered and all the rest than it would have been if we tried to do it all with, town halls at 50 different locations around the Commonwealth. And I think in many ways, people are sort of cataloging a lot of these things associated with with virtual work learning and remote work and learning, and are trying to figure out, when they come out of this, what this means. And I've also talked to a lot of folks who have global operations, who sell products in lots of places around the world, who said to me, I had no idea how much money I spent on T&E, travel and entertainment. And we probably still need to spend money on travel and entertainment when people get back to seeing each other again. But I think our strategy on this one's going to be a little different than it was before. And you start adding all this stuff up and you realize that there are real consequences for us in the public sector around what this is going to mean for neighborhood development, for downtowns, for commuting patterns, for transportation, and for so many other things. And I'm not saying that, it's going to be easy to guess right on this, because I'm not sure that it is, but I do think it means, at a minimum, we need to really kick the tires on a variety of scenarios here to try and figure out what June, July, August, September of 2021, 22, and 23 are going to look like when we get to the other side of this, because I think it has the potential, if we lean into it in the right way, for a lot of really great things to happen. And if we miss it, and we aren't strategic about how we think about the way we make investments and the way we support what I believe is going to be a lean in this direction generally, it'll be a big missed opportunity. I will say that our fiscal situation as a Commonwealth is in better shape than I think most people would have expected. There's a bunch of reasons for that. The first is we did a lot of work with our colleagues in the legislature over the previous 5 years to build up a very significant rainy day fund. And when it started to rain, we had resources there to supplement the loss in tax revenue. In addition to that, the federal government has had several relief packages which have made it possible for us to support our cities and towns and our schools at both the K through 12 and higher ed level for the better part of the past year. We're still in the process of unpacking the legislation that was passed at the end of the last session. There's a tremendous amount of resource in there for childcare and for K through 12 education and for higher education. Again, that I think will be very helpful alongside state resources, and our budget was pretty aggressive on the K through 12 side, and we're continuing to make investments to satisfy the Student Opportunity Act that was passed a few years ago. But the amount of resource that will be available in the education space and the childcare space should be very significant for the next couple of years, and it will be even more significant if the president's current legislation that's being worked through the House at this point in time ends up getting passed. I do want to say two other things about the end of the session. One is the legislature delivered a terrific economic development bill at exactly the right time, because we need it. And included in there was the housing choice legislation that we've been working on, which will make it much easier for communities to develop housing of all kinds: senior housing, affordable housing, workforce housing, transit-oriented housing, multifamily housing. We have not kept up with the demands of people in the market for a long time on our rulemaking with respect to how you build housing in this Commonwealth. And this legislation, I do believe, after spending 4 years working this one with our colleagues in the legislature, could be one of the single biggest game changers we have to help us figure out and work with our colleagues at the local level to do what we're going to need to do to reimagine some of these issues as we go forward. The legislature also included significant resources to support community building and development, and also significant resources to support small businesses and sort of next act businesses, where the way people normally talk about the future of work, there are a lot of resources in there too to think about how we can help and support the next act in life sciences and artificial intelligence and cybersecurity and advanced manufacturing, and so many of the places and spaces that the Commonwealth is still great at and was certainly great at before the COVID pandemic began. The other piece I want to mention is that transportation bill, because That legislation includes, among other things, significant resources to do another accelerated bridge reconstruction program. And the last one was used by the previous administration to primarily focus on a small number of really big projects. We're going to use this one to focus on a larger number of smaller projects, but the concept is the same, which is you really can build bridges off-site and then rip and replace on the existing site in the course of a few days. It saves a ton of money, eliminates mind-boggling amounts of traveler exasperation, and is really, in some respects, a terrific tool from a financial, operational, design point of view. And we're very excited the legislature decided to give us another crack at that. It also includes the resources we need to finish two really important projects. One is the GLX project, which is a Green Line extension into Somerville, and the other one is South Coast Rail, which has been on the plate as a to-do since the 1990s, but is actually going to be operating, hopefully, and moving people from the South Coast to the Greater Boston area and back sometime in 2023. I also just want to mention that we are currently sort of in a pretty, I think, solid and good conversation with the legislature on the climate bill. I know the chamber has been involved in communicating on that one as well. There's a lot of really good stuff in that bill, and we believe that Massachusetts already has a nation-leading position in so many ways when it comes to climate, but that legislation, as it works its way through and hopefully comes back to our desk with some of the adjustments that we made, I think will give us a chance to continue to enhance our position there. We do remain, for all intents and purposes, the state that really kick-started the whole deep water offshore wind industry in the United States along off the East Coast in the Atlantic, with the first procurement we put together with the legislature back in 2016. And we've done several since then that have continued to sort of bang the drum for this as a big opportunity for folks on the East Coast. The other project we've got that continues to move forward is one of the largest hydro projects with our colleagues in Maine and with Hydro-Quebec up in Canada. And you talk to almost anybody in Vermont, and they'll tell you that their relationship with Hydro-Quebec has been one of the most important elements of their energy and environmental and economic development strategies for the better part of the past 20 years. Republican or Democrat, the first person who started talking to me about Hydro-Quebec after I got elected was Howard Dean, who is the former Democrat governor of Vermont and obviously a candidate for president at one point as well. So let me just close with this. I think the COVID issue is going to be with us for quite a while. I do think vaccinations, especially if the feds can amp up the supply, will make a really big difference in not just providing support for people physically and clinically, but also emotionally. And we do see very positive trends across the Commonwealth with respect to COVID generally at this point. I hope that gives us the ability at some point to open up our economy a bit more. We're starting a pooled testing program with a bunch of K through 12 schools when they come back, which would be Monday, which I believe can also help us get a lot more kids back to school in person here in the Commonwealth, which is obviously a great thing for kids and for their education and social and emotional development, but it's also just a really good thing psychologically for everybody. And I think in many ways, one of the great challenges we're all going to face as we sort of work our way out of this is what exactly does that new normal look like, and how do we make sure as a Commonwealth, both on the private side and on the public side, that we're making the right kinds of investments and thinking about what we should be doing and how we should relate and operate in that new world, whatever it might turn out to look like. And I know the whole year has been a grind for everybody. I got asked by a reporter the other day, I said, it's been a pretty rocky road, don't you think? And I said, you should read my mail. I feel incredibly grateful to to have had this chance to serve despite, as Ann pointed out, 28 days of snow, 20 days after we took office, a giant gas explosion in the Merrimack Valley, ice storms in Western Mass, tornadoes on the Cape right at the beginning of the summer tourism season, um, droughts in 3 of the 5 years that I've been governor, um, and COVID. When you sign up for these, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. But the the heart and the resilience of the people in Massachusetts, which I kind of always knew were there because I grew up here, um, have been on full display for the entire 6 years. And one of the great parts about this job is you do get a chance to get in front of a lot of people on their turf and give them a chance to give you a sense about who they are and what they're about in a very familiar way, even though you don't know them that well. And for me, the greatest and most rewarding element of this whole job has been the chance it's given me to sit on the front steps, figuratively, of so many different people's houses and talk to them about their lives and come away just so incredibly pleased and proud of the people who live here. It's a great state, and we should all never forget that. And with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to Jim.
Well, thank you, Governor, for those remarks and for reminding us what these events are like in a live setting. As you were talking about that, I was reminded that I normally have the opportunity to say thank you not only to you but your team when we're in a live setting.
That's right, because they're all sitting in the audience.
Yeah. So I do want to take a moment to acknowledge on behalf of the Boston and Massachusetts business community the work of Lieutenant Governor Polito, your Chief of Staff, Kristen Lepore, the entire cabinet, but the ones we most interact with, of course, is Secretary Keneally, Secretary of Acosta, and of course, Secretary Sutters these days. So I don't know if they're listening or not, but I did want to express that gratitude to the entire administration for their work,
I'll pass that
especially
along,
over the
Jim.
last
Thank
year.
you.
One quick vaccine question. As we've talked about it at the chamber, at the board and executive committee, we think about 3 legs of the stool, and you addressed 2 of them, the supply issue, the process and logistics issue. It seems that particularly in communities of color, there's a big trust issue as well. Ann Finucane and I were talking about that before we started the session. How much of a factor are you finding trust in the vaccine as the vaccine rollout has been going on?
So that's a really good question. Part of the reason we really wanted to go as early as we could on the congregate care stuff was because you had a lot of people in those congregate care settings, both the people who are being served and the people who were taking care of them, who are people of color. Same goes with the long-term care space, especially on the staff side, and in the healthcare and hospital space. There's a lot of folks who work in those settings who are people of color as well. And when I look at our numbers overall, which need to get better, but in many respects are better than we see in most parts of the country in terms of the percent of our Black, Latinx, and Asian populations that have been vaccinated so far. I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that by focusing on PCAs and home health aides and healthcare workers in congregate care settings, we managed to pick up a bunch of people who have been around the healthcare system and have seen the impact of COVID generally and understand why it's important to get vaccinated. And one of the things we've learned from a bunch of the polling that we've seen and stuff we've done, but some of it's done by others as well, is that having a friend or a family member say they got the vaccine or they're going to get the vaccine is one of the most powerful ways of overcoming this very legitimate trust issue. The other is to try to pick trusted community partners for us to partner with on this. And in many cases, the most trusted community partner for a lot of folks is their clinician. And our approach to that has been to work really closely with the community health centers, which have deep roots in a lot of these communities and are very trusted partners. And they've been pretty successful so far in and encouraging people to get vaccinated. We also started about a $2.5 million ad campaign in multiple languages, which again featured mostly clinicians talking about why it was important to get vaccinated. And they're all local clinicians, and it says right on their white coat where they work. But we're also going to work with the local community health centers and the local boards of health and the 20 communities that we consider to be the ones that were sort of hardest hit and for which we need to do the most work on creating campaigns and strategies locally with them and with some of the trusted voices in their communities to encourage people to get vaccinated. And I think the good news is almost all the polling I've seen does not say people will never get vaccinated or never want to get vaccinated. There's a small number of people who say that. It's less than 10%. But there is a pretty significant number of people who kind of want to wait and see. And I think to the extent that we can rely on some of the people who are leaders in these communities, especially in the healthcare space, and have managed to get a bunch of folks vaccinated because of where they worked, I think we can sort of create a path forward there, but we're going to have to stay on it. And as Ann said in her remarks earlier, recognize that this is something that is going to require what I would describe as a consistent messaging coming from people who are considered to be trusted members of the community to be successful. And we pay very careful attention to this, and we're going to continue to do that. And we have put and will continue to put real resources behind trying to get it done. But it's a big challenge.
Governor, you mentioned in your remarks the crises that have occurred over your administration, global, national, some on a local level. And certainly over the past year, another crisis that reared its ugly head is around race and equity and opportunity. I was thinking that you mentioned the last time you spoke at a government affairs forum was a year ago. And I think one of the last face-to-face meetings we had was when you called me up to your office to talk about how government and the business community can do a better job in issues of supplier diversity. And I think it was early March of last year that we had that conversation. You announced a new supplier diversity office. What are some of the tools that the state has available, and what do you think, particularly is the small business community and small businesses of color seek to recover? What do you think the strategies, tactics moving forward in that dimension are?
So one of the things, I remember that meeting, by the way. You're right, it was right on the edge of when everything changed. One of the reasons we put together such a big small business grant assistance program, it's actually the largest in the country. It's a $720 million program where small businesses can access up to $75,000, not in loans, but in grants. Or whatever, sort of 3 months worth of operating support looks like, depending upon the kind of business and the size and all the rest. But a big part of the reason why we put together such a big program with the legislature and ran it through the Massachusetts Growth Capital Corporation was because a ton of the businesses that are small and don't qualify for or participate in sort of the federal PPP program and some of the other things that are out there is because a lot of them are owned by and operated by people of color in communities of color. And of that amount of money, I mean, literally hundreds of millions of dollars have gone to preserve storefront operations and indoor dining and restaurants and other sort of retail and indoor entertainment venues and cultural organizations that are operated by and owned by people of color across the Commonwealth in many of our cities. In Boston in particular, I think in Boston, of the 515 million that's been released so far, which represents roughly 11,000 businesses, my recollection is Boston has gotten about $66 million, and that's gone to, I think, as many as I'm not going to get the number right on the total number of businesses, but I can tell you the vast majority of those businesses have been owned and operated by people of color. So point number one here was to try to keep them, in business until the dust sort of settles on some of these issues associated with COVID in the first place. And we did create a supplier diversity operation, filed legislation with the legislature, which they accepted, which is great. And the idea there is to use that office to do two things. Number one, create a more sort of intentional framework for agencies around what we expect out of them in terms of purchasing from a broader array of contractors. And the second is to be able to do a lot more outreach to communities of color and to businesses and people of color to get them to go through the process and become certified to participate in the state's contracting regimen. We've done a lot to simplify that, and we've also made it possible for people to deem if they have certain standing in other kinds of entities like the minority contractors of New England. If you're a member of you can get deemed to be certified for Massachusetts if you join that organization and get qualified there. But there's no question that we have discovered that we need to do more outreach on the businesses that are out there end of things, and then more work on creating a more explicit framework for state agencies around what's expected of them and some of the strategies that they can pursue when they're putting work out to bid to make it happen. And then the final two things I'll just mention, the last piece of really big property at Boston State Hospital for development purposes went to a Black-owned developer, and he is partnering with an out-of-towner, but it's the largest, I'm pretty sure it's the largest project of its kind being operated by, development project of its kind being operated by a person of color in the Commonwealth, maybe ever, and certainly on state property.
Right. Governor, you mentioned the Student Opportunity Act and funding for K through 12 schools. Part of the law that we like that requires districts to develop plans for closing achievement gaps. A question during the pandemic that arose was the approach to student assessments. And, we've advocated for doing that. Some think it might be unfair, but how else are you going to know sort of what students have fallen behind and how much they've fallen behind? What are your thoughts on student assessments this spring and as a tool to measure the gaps that have sort of increased?
Yeah, I think Commissioner Riley has this exactly right, which is the reason you need to administer an MCAS exam at a bunch of different grade levels is just to get a sense about where people are. The feds have put some big time money already on the table around K through 12 and are poised to put a lot more on the table if as I said, the president's package makes it through. And I would really like to see us here in Massachusetts use a bunch of that to inform, how summer school and acceleration academies and other opportunities for kids, many of whom hopefully will be able to go back into the classroom for at least a few days a week during the summer, because I do expect COVID's going to be a lot lower and a lot more people are going to be vaccinated, to try to, catch up. And if you don't do some kind of an assessment to figure out where people are, it's going to be pretty hard to figure out how to frame what it is you might want to make available to them to help them catch up. And I think I think that's a reasonable, appropriate, and absolutely necessary approach to sort of gauge what's happened with kids over the course of the past year. I know there are some school districts that have been, there are some school districts, some schools in the public sector that have been operating since September, okay? Some of the special needs programs actually never stopped operating. They operated all the way through the spring and the summer and still operated all the way through this year in person. And there have obviously been some terrific examples of public schools that have done the same thing in certain school districts. And obviously the parochial school story is a great one. They've been in person since early August and have had very little COVID transmission take place over that period of time. And I do think this pool testing initiative, which we worked with a bunch of school districts and some of the labs here on, which we had over 100 schools and districts interested in when we first started talking to people about this a couple of months ago. We've done some demos over the course of the previous few weeks before kids went away for a week, and starting next week, a bunch of them are coming back. And I think it has the potential to be a big win for sort of the second half of the school year for the districts that are willing to step up and for the kids who would benefit from it.
Great. Governor, several comments and questions in the chat around your mention of the Future of Work initiative. Couple of them for me, making sure that the chamber engages and supports that. So we'll do that. But I guess leading to the question about, the plans for engagement with members of the business community in that exercise. But it also made me reflect on a panel conversation we had earlier this week with some technology leaders, Jim Heppelman at PTC and Corey Thomas at Rapid7 and others. And we talked a little bit about this. When you think about the future of work, it's of course is impacted by some of the rapid adoptions of technology in the world of technology. And we talked about the fact that, the West Coast might have won the 20th century race on, leading the world in technology, but, Massachusetts should win the 21st century race. So how do you think about that, Governor, and owning the future of Industry 4.0, AI, robotics, and applications of technology to the way we work?
I think part of that is always going to be driven for us by the quality of our K through 12 and especially our higher ed community. One of the reasons we have been successful as a Commonwealth forever is we have a lot of really smart people who either grow up here, go to school here and stay here, or grow up somewhere else, come to school here and then stay here. And I think the foment of clusters, intellectual clusters around life sciences and artificial intelligence and the investment that the folks over at MIT are making in this, I think will be a really big deal. And the eventual build out of the campus that Harvard's talking about over in Alston, I think will have significant benefits to the region over time as well. But, most people forget that UMass Amherst graduates more engineers than any other school in Massachusetts. And they've been on a terrific role in this space for the better part of the past decade. Chancellor Supaswamy there has done just an amazing job. BU and Northeastern also have really robust programs in the tech and engineering spaces. And I think the great opportunity we have here, and part of the reason why we focus so hard on trying to come up with a testing strategy that we could support for our colleges and universities, is to make sure they don't miss a beat and they continue to be successful and to do the great things that they've done for so many years here. And I think in some ways, we will continue, as I said in my remarks, to try to be helpful and supportive of initiatives that involve, education and business around life science, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and so many of the other spaces that are related to this. The Mass Tech Collaborative, through its Advanced Manufacturing Center and its Cyber Center, have built some pretty decent clusters and networks for people to collaborate through. And obviously the Mass Life Science Center has been a big player in investing in both the education of the next generation of scientists, as well as been a very solid supporter of a whole variety of companies that have chosen to put either more R&D on the ground here or to put their manufacturing activities a lot closer to their R&D and tech activities because of the constantly changing nature of their products and the way they develop. I think the whole platform that Pfizer and Moderna use to produce their vaccines in such a short period of time, the MNRA platform. That thing took forever to build, but now that it exists, it has tremendous potential to be a game-changing problem solver across all kinds of conditions going forward. And for all intents and purposes, Pfizer did a lot of their work here, and Moderna is obviously headquartered here, and there are a lot of people here who are working on a whole variety of next generation therapeutics that build off that same basic concept. So, I think the big thing we need to do in Massachusetts is to support the channels that create the brain power that makes some of this possible, and then to the extent that we can also support companies that are making decisions about either being here or growing here, do what we need to do to support them. We used to have a monstrous STEM week here for our high school and college kids every year, even some of our middle school kids. We lost, run by Lieutenant Governor and by Jeff Leiden, formerly from Vertex, and former Congressman Joe Kennedy. My hope is that we are going to continue once we get, out of virtual world, to get back into the business of really promoting in a big way both project-based learning and STEM education for a lot of these folks, because there are going to be tremendous opportunities here. And what we really need to do is make sure that, all the way up and down the stack, we're providing the support that people need to actually give kids and young adults a chance to take advantage.
Governor, my closing question, I'd like to ask you once again to reflect on the past 7 years. The business community has really enjoyed the close collaboration and working relationship of the mayor of our capital city, Marty Walsh, and you as governor. It has meant a lot, I think, to the economic success and the business climate here in Massachusetts. In the coming days, Mayor Walsh will move on to his new role as Secretary of Labor. Reflect on a little bit the importance of that relationship in doing your job.
So I didn't know Mayor Walsh that well before he became mayor, and I know he didn't know me that well before I became governor. But I paid him a visit during the transition and just started talking about stuff. And then, honestly, the snowstorms that happened shortly after we took office, we were talking almost every day. And, I really am going to miss the guy in a big way. I mean, I probably talk to him as much as I talk to anybody in public life. And my wife more than once has taken the phone away from me when I've been talking to him when I've been home at night or on a weekend, and said, it's nice to know that you guys are such good friends, Mayor, but this call is over, and you guys can talk again on Monday. There are two things that come from this. The first is, besides the lifelong friendship that I think he and I developed. I mean, I'm not kidding when I say I'm really going to miss the guy. We talked about a lot more than just politics. But there was never any hesitation about me calling him or him calling me about something that was a concern or something that was an opportunity. It just, like this, it just happened. And that bled all the way down into our staffs. So people knew that it was important for our administration and for the administration of the city of Boston to work closely together on things, because when they succeed, we succeed, and vice versa. And our constituents benefit too from that. And we didn't always see eye to eye on everything, but on the stuff we didn't see eye to eye on, we talked it over and figured out kind of a path forward that would work for one or the other of us, or for both of us, depending upon what the issue was. And I don't really think, I don't think the Commonwealth, Boston's really important to the Commonwealth of Mass, and it's really important to the region. And Greater Boston is really important to the rest of Massachusetts. And I say that as somebody who spends and has spent, along with the Lieutenant Governor, a lot of our time since we've been here in Western Mass and down on the South Coast and up in the Merrimack Valley, and And we get the fact it's a big state, and we need to and have paid attention to all of it. But there's a lot of opportunity and engine here that that needs to be treated with respect and an understanding that while these chairs for some period of time belong to us, you know, traditional political swordplay may be fun on the news, but it doesn't actually help get things that need to get accomplished done. Because more often than not, in business and in public life and in life, you know, things that stretch you, that ultimately benefit in a significant way, are usually things that require trust, and because they may or may not work. And you know, for people to stretch and to get out on a limb on things that matter, it's important to know that there's nobody back there who's going to be sawing it off if something doesn't work out quite the way it's supposed to. And I've had lots of conversations with businesses and with folks in the higher ed world and with people in the scientific community who have said that the fact that there is not a constant feud going on between state government and the capital city has been a reason they've been willing to make certain decisions, positive decisions, for the Commonwealth, for the city, and for the region. Who would have thought that, you know, a Bill Weld Republican and a Labor Democrat would end up having such a good working relationship. But in some respects, it's more than that. It is a really important personal relationship for me.
Well, we all recognized it, and I think the Commonwealth benefited from it. Governor Baker, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your ongoing leadership in this crisis, and from the business community, Godspeed. Thank you to our sponsor, Bank of America, and Ann Finucane for making this series possible, and Comcast for helping us share it with a wider program audience. And with that, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you, Governor Baker.
Thank you.